Back to this final segment of the show with Mr. Sam Latham, the publisher of the Urban Journal. And of course, Mr. Latham, before we had our final commercial break, we were talking about some aspects of advertisement dealing with the Urban Journal and other newspapers. But let's give you, over the last 6 minutes that we have here, an opportunity to talk about what newspapers are all about, and that is issues and whatnot. What do you, as the publisher of the Urban Journal, consider to be some of the major issues that you have to face and that you have to address doing your reflection on what this newspaper is going to be all about?
Well, thank you. One of the major issues, and perhaps one of the more perplexing, has to do with the reemergence of race as an issue. You know, at one time I think people thought that we had passed that stage, and in many regards it's hard to really tell whether racism, classism, but there's definitely a separation that exists, and I think it's even growing larger, whereas people have stopped talking to each other about some of those issues, and it's easy to overlook, but then when you really delve into it, Nashville's known as a progressive city. However, you have the flags that were erected last year. You have a statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest that was added to it this year. Then when you look at, even look a little deeper and more subtle issues, you find that corporate Nashville is still pretty much lily white. There are educational institutions here capable of producing leaders, but nobody's mentoring them. So nobody's getting them ready to take over a First American, a Dillard's, some of those places. So there's some things that we really have to get at, and I think that we have a responsibility to bring some of this to the forefront without necessarily causing confrontation or trying to polarize things, but feel that we really need to get on top of this before it is getting worse.
You know, I think quite recently, Mr. Latham, you will recall, we had a conference in town, Ed Fish University, the annual Race Relations Institute, and I think that you would probably agree that this is the kind of forum that you're talking about that we need to develop. Is that
it is the kind of forum, but the biggest problem that I think they did an excellent job of addressing race, but they were preaching to the choir. The governor should have been there, the mayor should have been there. People who can really do something.
Affect policy.
Right. Corporate Nashville wasn't represented. So the people who, I mean, I praise those liberals, people who are concerned about racial issues, but not the right people were there to listen to some of those messages.
Well, now, how do we, we've got 3 minutes, and of course, how do you convince the right people to come out? And I know precisely what you mean when you say the movers and the shakers, people who can have a tremendous influence. How do you convince many of these people to become involved in these discussions?
I think it's going to have to expand past a Ray Winbush or somebody, and I think he's doing an excellent job of addressing race. We've quoted him several times on issues, so he's more or less established himself as an authority. But until some of the other leaders get involved and let them know that this is just not a small minority of people that are interested in solving this racial problem or the racial divide, I think we need to use our economic clout. The days of going to the streets but with marches, it's over. So there needs to be a collective effort, and let's use that $1.6 billion of spending power, and there will be the interest.
Well, I think you mentioned earlier, in terms of education, don't you? Would you agree that African Americans probably need to be educated in terms of this power, because I don't think that many people recognize how indeed influential the dollar is in that regard.
Dr. Haney, the average black family spends more on groceries than the average middle-class white family. The white family, they'll eat out. So that $4,300 per year per home that's spent at grocery stores, if we withdrew that money or some parts of it, we're talking about over $300 million a year. we would impact the city. If we talked about the purchasing of cars, we're talking about $200 million a year of new cars. So we can impact, but it just has to be a different method. The way we get our message across has to be economic. And nobody's going to listen to us talking about marching and protesting in a minority voice.
Okay, but over the last minute that we have about the Urban Journal, how can people secure copies of the Urban Journal, and give us that kind of information and the cost of it and what you're trying to achieve in there over the last 40 seconds?
Yeah. Well, what we're trying to do, Dr. Haney, is convert it to a paid publication. Over the years, we've been free. So we have now about 150 locations. Hopefully we'll be able to get all the Krogers in the next few weeks and the MAPCOs. And subscriptions are available by calling the Urban Journal. We'll help them on that, 254-5176. And we'll be happy to take the subscription and tell them where they can purchase it.
Very good. And of course, Mr. Latham, let me thank you over the last 15 seconds we have for coming by and giving us that excellent information dealing with not only the Urban Journal, but the financial status of African Americans in this general area and the advertisement impact. And of course, let me encourage you to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.